Welcome to the fourth episode of PHP Release Radar, this time about XDebug 3.0, and our guest is Derick Rethans. Welcome, Derick. Very happy to have you here tonight.
Oh,
Maybe before we start, there is a chat in the live stream. You can ask questions directly to Derick in the chat room, and to let you know, we are about 10 to 15 seconds up front, so there's a bit of delay, so we try to get the questions in quite in time, but maybe the topic moved on already. So,
all right. Let me see if I can find this chat then.
Oh, you don't have to look at it. We have it on our screen, and then we just sprinkle it in the discussion, so you don't have to look at it all the time.
Oh, it's fine. I'm used to doing these things. Pop out chats. I can close that. I don't have to play the the video itself. I can just look at the chat.
awesome.
Okay, then yeah.
So, Derick, welcome.
Yes.
So,
Glad to be here.
you were one of the first that reached out on Twitter to tell us, hey, what about XDebug? Maybe you can give us a quick introduction. Who are you and what is XDebug?
So hi, I'm Derick. I've been working on XDebug for a long time now. It's close to 20 years, and XDebug is basically a tool, an addition to PHP in the form of an extension to make debugging and developing PHP easier. So that's the main idea behind it, and then it allows you to do that in many different ways.
So you mentioned 20 years ago it started. So what was the initial motivation to do it?
Okay, back then, and I can't remember which PHP version we were, PHP 4.1 maybe, something like that, is at that time, if in PHP, if you would call a function that called itself without you checking it, it would end up calling itself, and then it crashed, which is not nice. It's a traditional Stack Overflow. I mean, now websites are named after this, but the Stack Overflow is nothing new there, right? And in order to predict that, it's really difficult because it depends on the system about how many different nesting levels deep that goes. So the first thing I added to XDebug was this check to make sure that if this nesting level, this function calling functions, goes too deep, it would just tell you, you're probably doing something wrong, so I'm stopping the process for you, so you can investigate what goes wrong, and so PHP just crashes.
Yeah, I think that's a very famous setting until today, because if you work with larger applications like, I don't know, Symfony Cache, or I think Typo 3 has some issues in that. The default setting is 128 or something, and
it's 256 now, but yeah.
Okay. Yeah, sometimes you have to raise it even more because of some recursions. All right.
Yeah,
and
then as part of that, I then added a stack trace, because then you could see where it happened.
So there are additional things like enhancing the var dump output, right? There was
Yeah. So yeah, that was sort of the second thing. var dump, lots of people use it all the time. And to be fair, people still use it. I mean, sometimes it's just fastest way of doing it, right? And if it's a very simple issue, then sure, but why not try it? But var dump, as you know, it would blurt out HTML. So you always had to add pretext around it, and the formatting wasn't really great. So yeah, I overloaded var dump. That was basically something for me to try out whether you could, and yes. And then from there on, I started talking to some people that were developing an IDE, and they wanted some like debugging interface in their IDE. And yeah, I did a bit of work on that, made it look very simple, like GDB, which is like a C-level debugging tool, which is all command line. Of course, that's not particularly very usable. And then I ended up implementing a new debugging protocol together with can't remember the name of the company now. In any case, we developed a new protocol, and then I extended that with the people that work on Komodo by active state to make into a real debugging protocol, which is now pretty much what every PHP IDE or editor uses.
So
or can make use.
so the foundation of this protocol was built by you in the beginning as well.
Yeah, it was
Okay.
by me. Sorry, by me and the people that work on Komodo, because the protocol isn't PHP specific. They also have it implemented for Python and for Tickle and for XSLT, I believe, and Perl.
So you mentioned already there is a strong connection to the IDE, right? So how does the three parts of XDebug kick together? So there's the browser, there's the IDE, and there's PHP itself with the Xend extension.
Yeah. So that's 4 parts then, isn't it? You have the browser, PHP,
Yeah.
XDebug, and your IDE.
Sure. Yeah.
Nothing has changed between the browser and the web server, really. I mean, you request something, and you request something. Now, depending on whether you set a cookie, something might happen. So, what happens is that if in your browser you set a cookie, or you use a get or specific post parameter, which what most people use, they use now like this browser extension for that, so that you can just clickety-click in your browser to set a cookie for you instead of doing complicated things yourself. When PHP starts your script, XDebug can hook into these events, or pretty much hooks into everything, and it can see whether that cookie is set. And the moment that cookie is set, it will try to make a connection to your IDE. And depending on many different settings that XDebug has, fewer now with XDebug 3, it can do that to either an IP address or a host name that you configure, or there's a setting called Discover Client Host, which uses the HTTP headers to find out what the IP address is to connect to. But that sometimes gets really complicated if you have things like Docker or other networking in the way, because networking gets complicated because it's subnets and it's like Inception almost, right? It's things and things and things, so making these things more difficult. So I'm trying to improve on that, but it's still very tricky to do if you just have XDebug making a connection to your IDE.
Yeah, I guess from my user perspective, that's the most of the time I have issues with XDebug. It's because of the connection from a Vagrant machine or a Docker container to my IDE.
Yeah, XDebug 3 has a new feature or a new function embedded, which is called XDebug_info, which basically tells you what it has attempted to do if it was instructed to make a connection to your IDE, and it will tell you which host it has tried, from which HTTP headers, potentially why it couldn't connect, and then also fallbacks. So that's actually a really useful new thing to help you diagnose actually why connections don't work.
So XDebug Info gives me insights how the connection tries looked like or something like that.
Yeah.
All right.
Yes, if it failed. I'm still working on also adding information in case it actually worked. But that's less useful because that means that XDebug info is popped up in your IDE already. So it's less useful than when it fails, of course.
All right. And you mentioned XDebug hooks into everything. So XDebug itself is a Xend extension. So deep down the sea level of PHP.
So what PHP internally, it has many different hooks. So you can hook into the start of functions and the end of functions, and also into the creation of operas. And operas are PHP's internal representation of a function or a method or a main body of the script. And by being able to hook into these events, XDebug can then run specific code to do things. Like the start of the function is useful for debug and for step debugging, for example. And in the opcodes, if XDebug turns this on in the PHP engine, after every statement it will generate like a breakpoint instruction, and XDebug can hook into that specific bit because it's made for debugging, and then compare whether there's a breakpoint set on that specific line. So that's how that interaction works there. And then hooking into the opera structure creation is useful for code coverage, because the moment an opera gets created, XDebug needs to do some analysis to to figure out whether there's non-executable code and things like that in that specific function, or that code that can never be reached and things like that. Are there other hooks? There's a bunch of other things, like every instruction in the PHP runtime engine is something that you can hook into. You shouldn't do that too much because that makes things go really slow, but it's possible to do it. Like a concatenation of strings, or adding a number, or requesting a property. All these internal instructions use something you can hook into. And XDebug mostly does that for code coverage. And sometimes to do clever things, like if you use exit or die, XDebug hooks into that to make sure that it finalizes the profiling files that it generates and stuff like that. So that you get your summaries.
Yeah, you mentioned profiling, you mentioned debugging and developing tools like nested level and overloading Vardam. So I think for the most people, XDebug is a debugging tool, but we already learned that there are more tools in it. So so I think it's about 5 or 6 different tools.
So there's a development 8, which is like your overloaded Vardams and your nested stack protection, and it does a few other things as well. There's a step debugger. So I'm trying to keep my fingers in the screen, but I'm going the wrong direction because it isn't mirrored and I get confused. There's code coverage, mostly used together with PHP units. There is the profiler. There's GC stats collection, statistics information.
For the garbage collector.
Yeah, for PHP's internal garbage collector, which is a very niche thing to want to have a look into. And then there is something called function tracing, which is a way of writing to your file, to a file, every single function call with arguments, every variable assignment, and every return value, which can be really useful if you're seeing a new code base that you're not familiar with. To see what's going on there.
Used that a lot in a certain project. Yes, but sometimes
for one of my contracts, I work on a tool that is APM, and it is really, really useful to figure out what frameworks do when they call specific method actions, because the action methods, they are called, well, you don't know what they are because the APM tool doesn't know what these things are called up front, right? Because it needs to run with every project in the world. But by looking into this, you can see the sort of the stack trace, and you know exactly in which way you end up at calling that action method, and hence you can hook into that in that case. And tracing is the only thing that really makes it easily possible to do.
You mentioned you work on different projects, and I think your Twitter profile says you are a C contractor.
Yeah.
And your name already came up when we talked with Gabriel and Sarah about PHP 8. That you were calling for the new release managers. So
it's the job of the existing one, right? So if you're the PHP 7 for release manager,
okay,
you have to figure out who the 8 ones are. And so Gabriel and Sarah are going to have to figure out who's the release manager for PHP 8.1 now.
Okay, so well, PHP 7.4, you have. I wasn't aware of the fact that you are the release manager, but that was now it's more than 1 year ago.
Yes, we are making the 16th release.
In total.
Yep, PHP 7.4.15 comes out tomorrow, and
okay.
that is 15 is the 16th release because we start counting with 0.
Yes, sure.
And that is without the beta releases and the release candidates, because to be honest, nobody tries them out anyway.
But you work as a C contractor, and you work a lot on PHP, and I imagine you work on XDebug a lot of your working days as well. So how does it work for you as a maintainer? Is it just in your free time, or is it more your daily job?
So about 2 years ago, I worked for MongoDB for a long time, working on their PHP extension, and about 2 years ago now, I can't even remember. Probably 2 years ago now.
I checked before. I was like, oh, it was like last year or so, but it was January 2019.
Yeah, it's 2 years ago. A bit later, probably February or something like that. But yeah, in the last 2 years, what I've been wanting to do is to to work on XDebug more as a job. And I mean, I live in London. London's pricey, so I can't do that from just XDebug. So I do some on the side contracts. So one of my projects was getting rid of the mirror system in PHP, for example, because it's now all behind a how do you call these things? The content delivery network. So we don't need that anymore. In the past, I've written extensions for people, and at the moment, I'm helping out a German company called Instana. Sorry, they're called IBM now. um, and they make an APM solution to application performance monitoring. So I'm working on that now as my sort of side contract to say. But most of my time I spent on XDebug now. I produce a monthly report where I also outline what I've been working on. And more so in the last year, I've been working on a project around XDebug called XDebug Cloud that will make these connection issues that we touched on earlier a lot easier by bouncing your connections through a hosted solution where both XDebug make a connection to and your IDE. And that is always a lot easier to just to connect to a random outside IP without having machines in different subnets having to talk to all the different internal subnets, for example. And yeah, I'm putting the finishing touches on that to get that launched. My plan is to do that this week, but we'll see how that goes.
Yeah, maybe we have the chance to speak about XDebug Cloud later on a bit.
Sure.
I was interested in you. You say you work on it a lot of your time, and I checked. I think it's about not 100 of contributors on GitHub. I imagine that the project is older than GitHub, so there is a lot of commits missing, maybe.
But started out in CVS. Can you remember that?
Me personally, not. But how does it work for you to maintain or provide releases for multiple operating systems, doing it for Windows and not non-thread safe and thread safe?
So, I don't really make binaries. The only binaries I make are for Windows. Mm-hmm. But I run CI tests for Linux, for Mac OS X, or Mac OS or whatever it's called this year, and Windows. And these CI systems I will run with set trend safe mode on and off, and with opcache on or off, if that makes sense. Now for, I don't quite remember, on things like Appveyor, I don't think I run ZTS versions, but it doesn't really make much of a difference if I run it for all of them. It is important to run that on Windows, most specifically, because that's where people end up using that most of the time. But yeah, the only binary releases I make are for Windows, because Windows users don't usually have a compiler installed. But even if I didn't, the PHP Speckle project will also, for every release that's being released, build a binary as well that people can also install. So there's two ways of getting Windows binaries on OS X and on Linux and other Unixes that you might find. You can always compile it yourself. But I don't necessarily always test with these all the time. Luckily, C is pretty portable. So
yeah, I was once working with a old PHP version and I just used a modern Docker image and could just compile it. It was not really an issue, so that makes sense. But you mentioned you have a CI pipeline, and how do you catch regressions, or how does it work when you bring out a new major release? How do you get feedback? Was there a testing phase with beta releases or release candidates?
To be fair, I don't usually bother, mostly because nobody ever tests them. So in my opinion, it makes more sense to just bring the release out, and then people use it. They might find bugs. Because yeah, people just don't test release candidates. So why make them? Why spend the time on doing it?
Yeah, that worked pretty well then. It's just 2 patch releases since the major release, I guess.
So one more time.
That strategy worked out because there are only 2 patch releases since the major release, I guess.
Yeah, but there's a bunch more coming up that I want to work on. The idea is to make about 1 bug fix release a month until XDebug 3.1 comes along. But my another main thing where I run CI for is, for example, this, right? So what I have here is on xdebug.org/ci. Every night, my big machine under my desk runs all the tests, but it most importantly runs the test against master, which is PHP's master GitHub branch, and that tells me whether Nikita has added something new to PHP that then breaks XDebug, which does happen occasionally. And when this happens, I get an email as well. So this is my own CI that runs every night under my desk, or whenever I tell it to run it against all my PHP versions, of which I have many. I can show you that too. These are local PHP. Oh, I shouldn't have used the -L because there's too many in them. There's many PHP versions that I run against, or can run against.
So
and this of course doesn't include... Yeah, so these are for my contract, not for XDebug.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, for XDebug, the only things I will support are the ones that my CI runs. And I try to track whenever a release comes out, like 3.0 comes out or 3.1 comes out, whatever PHP supports at that moment, I will continue to support for that version of XDebug as well. So
yeah, that's great. So the CI is also online available. So
and this is, I mean, all the others are all on GitHub. So
yeah.
Anything that I do myself, create a pull request, and that runs the 3 CI pipelines. I use AppVeyor, I use Circle CI, and Azure pipelines.
All right. So final question for the first part, maybe.
And I see there's a few questions in the chat as well, which I'm happy to answer.
Oh, yes, we can do them in a minute. So you mentioned that you're using a debugging protocol, and which is not PHP specific anymore. Do you look at other debuggers, other languages for inspiration, or how do you improve XDebug?
So at the moment, it doesn't really help to look at other languages because the protocol itself is pretty okay. So once in a while, we do find issues, and issues isn't really the word for it, but things that can be found for improvements. But I tend to find these things while talking to makers of IDEs. To be fair, JetBrains and the PHP Storm team most of the time. And yeah, I have conversations with them to add things to the protocol. Like XDebug 2.9 has a new feature in it called Resolve Breakpoints, which is a way for the IDE and XDebug to communicate that sometimes if you set a breakpoint on a line that looks where you have code in PHP, but PHP has internally sometimes has different opinions about where there's actually code. The IDE and XDebug can now negotiate the correct line where a breakpoint should happen on. Basically, where XDebug just checks in the engine, in the opcodes, where the lines are that actually have code on it, and then they communicate that back to the IDE so that can update its breakpoints. So things like that have been added. But to be fair, it's been pretty much unchanged since, well, maybe 2004, 2005. So the protocol itself is done pretty well. And it's documented online, so that all the IDs can also implement it, and many have.
Okay, so how does it work? The people at JetBrains just ping you and say, hey, we have a new feature idea. How could you, or how does it work that a feature comes to life with XDebug and PHP Storm?
Well, most of the time, the ID PHP Storm in this case doesn't really have to add much, but sometimes they want to get a bit of more information, so they get these notifications now that breakpoints are actually on a different line. But yeah, I sit around the table with them maybe once every 3 to 6 months or so, figure out whether there's any issues that we can improve on to make the debugging experience, so, excuse me, easier, and then figure out ways to do that. And that doesn't always come to a reasonable conclusion, but not most often it does.
Okay,
So
great.
yeah, it's just having a discussion with them pretty much.
So let me have a look at the questions.
Mhm.
So Rod asks, too many books, huh? What's your favorite one, if any? So I think he's referring to your bookshelf.
Yeah, my fake bookshelf. It's not fake. It is actually mine. But, my favorite books aren't on there. I read lots of different things. I read science fiction as well as non-fiction. Sorry, yeah, there's a non-fiction. You can just about see it in the corner of my screen here. There's a book called How to Be Liberal, which is about the history of liberal politics, which I found very interesting last year. And then some of my favorites, most of the other fiction books that I read are all science fiction. So I've been enjoying The Expanse, which is also an awesome TV series. And yeah, I can't really think. And I recently finished the Long Earth series by Terry Pratchett and Neil Gaiman, which I also very much enjoyed. But I tend to read quite a bit. So, yeah.
So
I aim for 2 books a month. Don't always succeed, but that's what I aim for.
So, Rod, I hope you're happy with that. Roland asked, will there be a feature in future to rerun the code to the actual breakpoint to do just the same and not to reload or re-click the page?
Probably not. Because in PHP, you can't just restart a script. It is something that PHP needs to do on its own, and the only way how you can start something in PHP is by requesting a script through your browser.
So it's by design.
Yeah, it's not something you can do much about. However, what I will, once I got XDebug Cloud, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a minute, once that is going, what I'm looking at is to write another tool that sort of uses the instrumentation that is possible for tracing, because the tracer feature in in XDebug already. To if I would dump that in a very different format with a little bit more information, what actually would be possible to do after every statement, you'd be able to see the full stack, including all the variables, right? I mean, clever things need to happen for that, but it is a possibility. And the idea is that if you then have created this file by having run through your PHP application already, that it can talk to your IDE again, and your IDE can then not only step forwards but also step backwards, and you can basically seek through the whole execution of your script to see the current status of it, but it won't run actual code. But yeah, that is for probably the second half issue.
Yes. So to start with the second part, Dennis.
Let me unmute myself first before I share my screen. So as a quick break before we talk about something else, let's do a quick round of questions. So
Sure.
they are randomized. They might happen, there might be duplicates, but we can just jump over them. So this is basically the placeholder for now because I have to refresh. So the idea is that you just quickly answer the X or Y question, and then we just,
or in this case, X, Y, or Z question.
or that as well. So, okay, first one, PHP CS fixer or code sniffer?
I haven't used either because I don't write PHP code. Well, sorry, what kind of question is this?
Rest or soap? It's just random questions.
For use in the shower, soap. For programming, Rust.
Okay. macOS, Linux, or Windows?
I'm a Linux user.
JSON, XML, or YAML?
JSON for transport, XML for configuration, and YAML to swear at.
Okay, we're already at this one. Composer or NPM?
Oh, I don't do anything with Node, so that has to be Composer.
Okay. Light or dark editor theme?
Light.
Vardamp or XDebug? This is one that I was waiting for.
Both.
Okay, then let me stop sharing the screen. Yeah, you already mentioned since XDebug improves Vardamp, basically, even if you do Vardamp, you still get XDebug flavor if you want to.
Well, there is that, yes. But no, to be honest, now I've been working on the XDebug Cloud website because I want to test XDebug Cloud. I pretty much have every request going through it to make sure it's stable. And since I've started doing that, because it's just always on, I haven't used Vardamp a single time. Because it makes no sense anymore to do. I can just set a breakpoint and inspect the variables. Adding Vardamp is actually now more work. And because you have to type it, right? It's faster than just clicking a single line.
That sounds good, because nowadays it's usually, oh yeah, just to quickly Vardamp here because I'm too lazy to set everything up for XDebug.
Yeah, but that goes away if every single request goes through the debugger.
Yeah, if it happens anyway, then yeah, sure, makes sense. But yeah, maybe before we talk about XDebug Cloud, let's first talk about XDebug 3 a little bit, because we talked about the process before and how the development started. So maybe let's start with how XDebug 3 came to life. So 2 years ago, you wrote a blog post that you want to spend more time on XDebug 3. And you already mentioned that you plan like doing cleanups, for example. And maybe the first question, how much work was it? Was it as much as you expected? Was it more?
It was about as much as I expected, which was quite a lot. Because as you know, with any nearly 20-year-old code base, it's not very pretty. I mean, hopefully in 20 years you have learned a lot about software development, and so have I. So, yeah, there's lots of things that are just really nasty, lots of things that were intertwined, making it really hard to only turn on specific features. Something that XDebug 3 does that XDebug 2 doesn't is that you can turn on specific features. And that also means that you only get the overhead of the features that you have enabled, which is a very big change from XDebug 2, where basically everything was always turned on, and hence XDebug people rightfully complained that it was always really slow, which is not something that you find with XDebug 3 anymore, because you only get the overhead that is really necessary, which I think is a really useful thing to have. And then on top of that, I also improved the code itself to make it cleverer, so to have less overhead as well. And yeah, that was quite a lot of work, but I knew it was a lot of work, but it was interesting to do. It's always nice to modernize code that you have seen for so long, and you really know, yeah, I really should change that, but it's not something you can just do in your free time, because it is a concerted effort. It is hundreds of hours of work, and that means several months. And yeah, but it was important to do. And as part of that, I will also started. Sorry, I have a frog in my throat. I've been setting things up like Patreon and GitHub sponsors and things like that to help me out with that, because I do need to pay for the bills.
Sure.
Yep.
Yeah, it was a lot of work, but I think it paid off.
I mean, at least from a user perspective, from performance, we can already see that it definitely worked out.
Yeah.
So, did you encounter any problems that you didn't expect when working on XDebug 3? Anything that stands out, like, oh, I didn't even know this would be an issue for a new major?
Well, because configuration changes, I've tried to make it a lot easier to understand, which what I see in comments on Twitter, people seem to agree with that. It was also a good move. But yeah, naming things is harder than caching an off by one error, right? So yeah, that is kind of hard, because it's not like a technical thing, right? It's like, what do you think would work best for people to understand what this thing does? And I'd never thought about that when working on XDebug or developing it, because I just wanted to get the code out, right, to get it working. But I have now spent more time on how can I make this easy for people to understand when they see names of things, for example. And that was a bit tricky. And technical wise, I found also a few things that this is done in a really crappy way. Maybe there's a better way, and I talked to Nikita Popov quite a bit because I run a podcast called PHP Internals News. You can see the URL in the bottom here, where I talk about the development of the PHP language. And because Nikita does so much, I end up talking to him a lot, and it's always nice to be able to bounce ideas off him, because he knows the PHP internals better than I do. Yeah. And me working from home on my own on XDebug, I don't really have any coworkers here. I mean, the elephants are nice, but they're not particularly very useful for pair programming.
At least for Robert, I can use them.
Yes, I do.
Okay, maybe can you go through some of the major changes, especially breaking changes that happened from XDebug 2 to XDebug 3?
Well, the breaking changes is mostly that you need to turn on the feature if you want to make use of it. So most of the breaking changes, they are all in names of configuration, the way how you configure XDebug. Those are the things that have been changed, and not interaction with IDEs or output formats or anything like that. It's only basically the configuration itself. Let's see. I very nicely, I think, created a like an upgrade guide for XDebug called "Upgrading from XDebug 2 to 3," also available in Japanese if you want, but I'll switch back to English, where I explain what the new concepts are, and also further down, sorry, where the functions have changed, for example, and then all the changes with configuration. So if you used to use XDebug autotrace before, it says now use xdebug.mode equals trace, and you start with requests, and so on and so on. So I've tried making these names easier. For example, yeah, I'm not sure what else I can say here.
How did the Japanese translation come about?
Oh, somebody I have a Twitter search term in TweetDeck for XDebug, and I saw this person just tweeted out XDebug, and then there was this in Japanese. And when I followed the link, I noticed that this looks like a translation of the upgrade guide. I said, that's nice. So I just sent him a reply to the tweet saying, if you have this, it makes sense to have this on the XDebug website. And I need it in a slightly different format. Would you like making a pull request for this? And they did. So, and then I still had to change the XDebug website a little bit to allow for translations and things like that. But yeah, that's how it ended up here.
Oh, that's a cool idea.
Yeah, so, I'm usually reluctant of having translations for documentation, especially for the functions and features, because it goes out of date pretty quickly, and there's nothing worse than having an outdated translation. Whereas for the upgrade guide, because it is something that you basically write once and don't update, it's not a problem.
Yep, that makes sense. So in the future, do you think that maybe for the next upgrade to 3.1 that you do this as well, where you have like community translations to help this out, or?
I can do, but XDebug 3.0.2.3.1 is not going to be a breaking change, so you wouldn't need an upgrade guide for it.
Okay.
The only thing that will be necessary there will be if there's new features in it, that these are also documented in the change logs. But there's no reason why I couldn't have translations for that either. But so far I've never done that.
Okay, so I know that since we have the upgrade guide, we could look it up, but maybe can you still explain a few things that people should look out for when they do the upgrade?
Yeah, so all your configuration is changed. So everything that you thought was working on XDebug 2 pretty much does no longer work on XDebug 3. It's not quite true, but many things have changed names-wise. So yeah, please do read your upgrade guide because it tells you what to do. The main things is that instead of having a setting for turning on every feature on its own, like profile enabler, or debugger enable or trace enable and all these things are now all xdebug.mode equals name of the feature that you want to turn on, or there's actually a comma separated list of features that you can enable or not, because often it makes a lot of sense to have debug as well as develop on at the same time. But I would not recommend you turn on code coverage and profiling and tracing all at the same time, because profiling with all the overhead of all the other features makes profiling less useful. But in general, you are suggested to only turn on one thing at the same time. And this is something that has to happen in PHP INI. You can't do this in htaccess or if you have Docker containers, where you don't really want to change your configuration settings, because that means a rebuild of your image almost, or at least of a layer. But you can restart that with an environment variable, and that then gets picked up to enable features in XDebug. On top of that, anything that has the word remote in it doesn't have the word remote in it anymore. So remote host is now client host, because it doesn't have to be remote. It's a complicated word. It doesn't really mean anything. And I've also gone through the documentation, updating the terminology in there to match what the settings use as well. So that is a big thing that has been changed, and probably the biggest thing that has changed.
The default port has changed as well. Can you maybe elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, so XDebug, since its inception, always used port 9000. And about 3 months after XDebug came out with that port, PHP FPM came out. I used the same port. It's very handy. No. Now, changing the default port is something I always wanted to do, but the documentation for DBGP, which is a debugging protocol that we mentioned earlier, actually has it defined as port 9000. But it was getting so annoying, and so many people had problems with it, that XDebug 3 now defaults that to 9003. And I discussed that with people, with the JetBrains, people that work on PHP Storm, because their default is of course also 9000. But the latest versions of PHP Storm, which is 2020.3 and later, will by default listen to both 9000 and 9003 unless you change the setting yourself. So that's really handy to have. But yeah, it uses 9003, but as far as I understand, doesn't conflict with anything yet.
Maybe in a few weeks something new comes out.
Well, it is possible. So what I actually tried to do is I actually tried to reserve the port with IANA, which is where they have a registry of all the ports that I use for applications. But that was so bureaucratic that I gave up on it. It's not worth my time.
Well, it works for now, so...
Yeah, I think 9003 is fine. I can always change it to another one. But at least it shouldn't conflict with PHP FPM anymore, which is usually a very big thing. And the XDebug diagnostics page that you can reach through XDebug_info will also tell you whether things are conflicting.
Yeah. So XDebug 3 was released, I think, late November, right? That's a few months already. Did you already get feedback on how people use it, how it help people, maybe also some issues that already occurred?
Yeah, I mean, it's a new release. Bugs are found. There was a few issues where using environment variables for triggering features. It didn't matter what name you used, it would always trigger all the features that were enabled in XDebug. So even if you set XDebug_profile as an environment variable, or you use your browser extension to enable that feature, if you had debugger enabled, it would also trigger the debugger. And things like that. And there's been a few crash bugs, a few issues with compiling on some more esoteric platforms. I mean, it's the standard things that you find. But from the major feedback that I see, which I see on Twitter pretty much by using my sneaky search keyword, it's all been very beneficial. People seem to be happy with it.
You already mentioned that you basically don't do release candidates because you don't get feedback. Is there another way for people to give feedback to you other than Twitter?
Well, there's an issue tracker if you find real issues. I mean, don't use it for support questions. Uh, but if you think you found a bug, yeah, it's bugs.xdebug.org for feedback. You can also email me. I mean, it's a bit old-fashioned, but it works. I'm pretty bad replying to emails quickly, but I usually will get to them.
Okay. And then maybe the final question before we can talk a little bit about XDebug Cloud. Do you have already plans for the next XDebug releases? Something big that maybe probably feature-wise you already mentioned that the protocol is pretty much stable and working, but
so what I want to do next XDebug 3.1 is I want the protocol to go over SSL, or sorry, I should say TLS. So the main reason for that is that it's actually XDebug Cloud, because normally if you only debug on your own network, it doesn't particularly matter whether it's encrypted or not. But once it goes over the open internet, yeah, you really want it as TLS. You really want it TLS protected. So that is something that needs work. It needs work on XDebug and also needs support in IDEs. Now, PHP Storm, I think, would not be hard to add because they already do it for the IDE to XDebug Cloud servers side of things. It's just not yet between XDebug and an IDE or between XDebug and XDebug Cloud. Doing it between XDebug and an IDE doesn't make a lot of sense because you need then certificate management in the IDE, and that is just too much faff, so that doesn't make a lot of sense to do. But once you bounce it through something else, it makes sense. I also want to add to XDebug 3.1 a few things that allow it to make it easier to use XDebug Cloud, but the big feature thing beyond that is, as I've already hinted at, is using this tracer to dump to like a binary file so that you can, in your IDE, seek through the whole execution of your script and application. So that's the big new thing that I want to be working on.
That sounds pretty good.
Yeah, maybe you can tell us a little bit more about XDebug Cloud. So for me, it's a little bit difficult to understand because usually I don't really see much of XDebug. So what would I expect of XDebug Cloud?
So it's the issue with making network connections. So there's a few situations where it is difficult to do. Sometimes it's because of firewalls. You can't actually make a connection. That are corporate firewalls that you can't punch through. And sometimes it's really hard if you don't want to deal with complicated Docker and Vagrant setups that might change every single time you work on a different project for a different company. For example, I mean, if you are like a freelancer, having to set it up every single time and it's different every single time might just be really difficult to do. Or in a situation where, which is actually an email that somebody sent to me, said, how can I debug in this situation? Where they said, well, us and our developers work in an office, and our development server that everybody uses is hosted somewhere else. And the network we run, we can't accept connections or redirect them to IDs, so how do you debug? And you can't at the moment. There's just no way of doing it unless you only allow debugging for one user at a time by setting up an SSH tunnel. And there's no way around that unless you make your IDEs to connect to an external service and your debug requests also going through that same external service, and that external service can then link them up together. So that is the idea about XDebug Cloud, is that because it is often really easy to make a connection to an IP address that runs on the internet, that also then allows for routing debug connections through it without you having to care about your firewall rules or your net settings or Vagrant or Docker, because it's no longer important. And it also would allow you to, for example, do debugging of things that are hosted in the cloud already. Like if you're hosting, so it's, just an example, I actually don't know whether they have support for XDebug, but say with Platform SH, they run a managed stack for you. But how would you debug that? I mean, you can't configure a specific IP address to connect it, right? Because it might not want to connect to that, or it's really difficult to do. But connecting that to an external service is then possible, and it would be possible without having to make changes to any settings. So that is the big things where XDebug Cloud is going to be useful.
I assume from a developer's perspective, it's probably easier to set up as well, right? For basically, in my PHP storm, I only have to connect to XDebug Cloud, and then I still have to set up my projects individually, but at least I know that my IDE is always set up correctly to this one service, right?
Yeah, so you need to set up your ID, and you need to add your XDebug Cloud key to PHP INI at the moment. And in XDebug 3.1, you would also be able to set your cloud key through your browser cookie. So XDebug 3.0 doesn't support that yet, but 3.1, where you can already set the IDE key through the cookie that's sent, but the XDebug 3.1 will also understand your cloud ID there as well. And then that makes it possible in the situation where you all share a development server somewhere that runs somewhere else to connect to only your ID without issues. So that's it.
Okay. Since Christoph and I are both Germans, and Germans are famous for the bureaucracy, maybe you already hinted at TLS as being one requirement. So I know from experience that with companies, you always have these huge security and compliance hurdles that you have to jump through. Do you have to do any major changes there for that as well? Or?
So in 3.1, it will be SSL. Oh, sorry, I keep saying SSL. I mean TLS. It will be TLS on both sides. In 3.0, it's only on the IDE to cloud side. But what I then want to do next, because it's point-to-point connections, right? The XDebug Cloud service could potentially read all the debugging information that goes over the wire. I don't, but there's the possibility of doing that because the TLS connection is terminated at that service. It isn't a peer-to-peer connection. So what I also then want to do on top of that, that won't be in XDebug 3.0 or 3.1, likely in 3.2, where there will be a shared key on the IDE side as well as on the XDebug side that the cloud service doesn't know, and use that as an extra encryption layer. So I can't see what goes over the wire, even if I wanted to. So yes, I've thought of that, but the implementation will be in the future.
Okay.
You need to start somewhere.
Makes sense. Do you already know which infrastructure it will run on? So I guess the cloud thing will be hosted by you and not like company specific, like enterprise setup.
Correct, yeah. It's something that I will host. I don't exactly know which service yet. I haven't really thought about it. At the moment, it runs on my own VPS. Which runs
That will be interesting to explain to compliance department.
Yeah, no. But I have sort of thought about that. So, what is actually possible? Like the keys that I generate or will generate, depending on the CRC of the key, it can connect to 16 different hosts. It is a.cloud.xdebug.com and b. And by generating the right key for the right place, what I can do is run XDebug Cloud service in different locations, and then just make sure that the keys actually link to these right locations. So I have thought about that, but it's not implemented. So yeah, what is possible to do is that to run one on, say, a German host like Hetzner, for example, so that companies in Germany don't have to move the data outside of the European Union, like to the UK, for example, or the US. I have no intention of running anything in the US. If anything, it'd be a EU-based host in any case.
One question comes to my mind. When is it available? I read that there is already something like a private beta or something.
I have done a private alpha, and my intention is that this week I work on all the pricing and sign-up forms and figure out taxes and invoicing and things like that. And yeah, I should have that part finalized by the end of this week is my goal. So I would say in the next week or so. I see somebody asking in the channel asking what's the expected price. It will be, or can I show? Should I show you that? Can. This is not final, by the way, so I'm still working on that. But this is what I'm working on at the working with at the moment. So I have a small package and a medium package. If you're in the EU, you're going to have a VAT number, because I can't be dealing with all these tax issues otherwise. So that's the idea behind it. So yeah, for the small package, it's, what is it, £16 per month per user, and the medium package, which is invoiced yearly, it is £10 per user per month, with a minimum.
All right. So I'm really hoping for you that this is something that will getting to fly or something.
I hope so too.
And I think
because it'd be nice if the revenue of that means that I can continue to work on XDebug.
Yes.
Because although I'm very grateful for Patreon supporters and GitHub supporters, but that's not quite enough for me.
Yeah, I can't believe that. But that was the last question I would have for you. So you mentioned GitHub sponsors and Patreon is one way to support your work on XDebug as well. All right.
Yeah. As well as because that they don't send invoices, and I've learned that companies in Germany are specifically keen on invoices. I also have like a business support scheme. Let's see if I can show you that as well. So let me switch things around. So I run like community, which is GitHub sponsors and patrons, but also have like a pro and a business package for people to then support me on XDebug, and they will get some support back for that in that case as well, and like a newsletter with the latest updates that you otherwise won't get, and things like that as well. And yeah, there's a bunch of companies that have signed up for that. Not about, but 10 at the moment. Yep.
Yeah. And I really can recommend to check Derick's YouTube and Vimeo account as well. That was what I was using to prepare myself for the night.
Aha.
Of course. And I think Dennis, do you have an open question from your side?
So just to drop in about the YouTube thing, like I've started making videos to introduce XDebug 3 with how to use it, what the changes are, and I'll be continuing to make more videos and animations, which take a long time to do. And then also extend that with material about how to use all of XDebug features, so how to set up the debugger, how to do profiling, and all these things. But that's more work for the rest of this year.
Yeah, maybe I can just share the link as well.
And at some point, perhaps make like a course out of it.
Oh, cool. Already, I think the videos are quite nice to get an overview for basically what's in there and what you can do with XDebug, and basically, I remember when I got started and basically I got the breakpoint, and then going from there can already be like very intimidating when you don't know what you're doing. Like, how do I get to my issue? How do I read all this stuff? How can I change things?
Yeah,
There's
absolutely.
just so much to discover around XDebug. So that would be nice to basically have someone take you by the hand.
Yeah, there's a lot of things in there that many people not aware of. Yeah, it's my goal to make. I mean, this also be my goal, right? I mean, not only improve the software, but also improve the documentation and explain to people how things work. Because if you don't know how things work and how to use them, then it's kind of pointless to write software.
Yeah, definitely. You want XDebug to be used by as many developers as possible.
Exactly, because it's all going to save us a lot of time.
Yeah, that's true. I saved a lot of hours using XDebug in certain situations.
Mm.
All right. So, Derick, do you have another point or a final remark you want to make?
I
yes.
don't really have anything else. Yeah, I see one more question. What is XDebug web page written in if not PHP? It's PHP. And it's on GitHub if you want to see it. It's github.com/xdebug/xdebug.org. If you want to have a look at.
Yeah, my guess he was referring to your note that you're not using PHP, but I guess
Not
it's
that much.
yeah.
No, it's definitely written by me. Just to answer the follow-up
Yeah.
question in the chat.
All right. So Derick, thanks a lot for joining tonight. It was very, very interesting.
You're
I
most
think
welcome.
XDebug is a project that is very, very handy and helpful in many developer lives, I guess. So it's quite interesting to get insights into your work with XDebug. So thanks for that.
You're
And
welcome.
to everyone else, thanks for joining in. And I think the next episode is next.
What is the next episode?
The next episode is next Thursday already. It's about Fly System 2.0, and it's with Frank de Jonge. So I think quite interesting as well.
Another Dutch person.
Yeah. I think well, in the PHP community, the Dutch persons are quite around.
It's true. Yes.
Yeah. All right. So thanks everyone, and good night.
Goedenavond.
Bye.
Bye bye. Cheers.
So.